You're listening to Westben's podcast Music for a While with Barb Hobart and Brian Finley. Today's episode is sponsored by Finley and Associates and Cameco. Thank you to all of our sponsors for your continued support of Westben. Now here are Barb and Brian with episode 7, Musical Travelogue for a While.
Hi, this is Brian Finley. Welcome to Music for a While, a podcast from the Westben Center for Connection and Creativity through Music. Today, we're going traveling. Barb Hobart and I will be your tour guides, and we even have a special guest at the end of the podcast. But first, good morning, Barb.
Good morning, Brian.
How are you doing today? You have your travel clothes on?
I have my travel clothes on, my bag's packed, my passport's ready.
Well, it'll have to stay that while for a little while. But anyway, back to your chair and turn your speakers up because this is going to be fun. Where are we going to go today?
Well, we're going to go to Prague. Then we're going to stay in Prague but talk about Czechoslovakia. And then I think we're going to, actually that's going to come at the end, but we're going to go to Seville as well.
Oh, fun. This is great. And apparently we even have a couple of river cruises thrown into this one.
We do.
Well, that's going to be great. Well, and I would also like to share some travels across our own beautiful country by playing a few of my Preludes to Canada, which is, as you know, a suite of 13 vignettes for solo piano.
I think that would be wonderful because I really feel that during this pandemic and when things open up a bit, people are not going to want to go across the sea, but to know places to go and visit in Canada would be wonderful and have music associated with them.
Yeah, it's a great point. Now, Barb, you're an Eastern girl, aren't you?
I am.
Where are you from?
I was born in Sydney, Nova Scotia.
Okay, well, we're going to start somewhere around there. Do you know where Newfoundland is from Nova Scotia?
Oh, indeed I do.
Okay, that's great. Well, we're going to start out in the far east, so to speak, of Canada. We're going to start in Quidi Vidi in Newfoundland. And it's Laundry Day in Quidi Vidi. Now, the tiny town of Quidi Vidi lies minutes to the north of St. John's, Newfoundland. It's a vibrant mix of cheerily colored buildings and refreshing local beer and astonishing natural beauty. And friendliness is everywhere despite the dramatically rugged seaside life. It's virtually the easternmost spot in Canada, and it's one of the first places in North America to see the light of each new day. So Laundry Day in Quidi Vidi envisions brilliantly colored laundry flapping happily in the wind on a sunny morning.
Which are few and far between.
That's true. Well, work with me here.
I'll work with you, yes.
And a fleeting but resilient metaphor for the cheerful people who inhabit this colorful yet austere place. It's a mixture of sunny laughter and profound dreaming. And you can watch the waves roll in and out, but you may also see a colorful sock flutter away in the wind.
It sounds wonderful.
So here is Laundry Day in Quidi Vidi from my Preludes to Canada. that was Laundry Day and Kitty Vitty from my Preludes to Canada. So, Barb, I guess the weather is pretty rough out there.
It can be very rough. As I said, someone once said that summer in Newfoundland was sort of 2 weeks at the end of July. Although I know someone who went there in September and said the weather was absolutely beautiful. So who knows?
I guess who knows? And it's it's part of this is all in the imagination as well too. So let's go with that. Now, bringing music together with place has been going on for a long time in musical history. I think of Bach's suites, for example, and each includes dance forms from Germany and Italy and France and England and Spain and everywhere else. And you can see, we also talked about Haydn's Paris symphonies and his London symphonies a while ago. And then there's Mozart.
There is.
So what about Mozart?
Mozart's Symphony number 504 was referred to as the Prague Symphony because it was premiered there on January 19th, 1787 during Mozart's first visit. The city was one for which he had a great deal of affection, partly because he was revered there, as opposed to Vienna, which was often less than kind to both the composer himself and his music.
And let's not even talk about Salzburg.
No, or the bishop.
That's right.
For instance, it was Prague and its citizens that loved his opera, The Marriage of Figaro, when it was presented there for the first time. Mozart himself once wrote, "My Praguers understand me." The Marriage of Figaro actually arrived in that city before Mozart did, and the extraordinary success of the opera came as a shock to the composer. He wrote in a letter that the opera was much discussed in Prague, and people even sang it in the streets. He said, "I watched with the greatest pleasure how everyone was hopping about with sheer delight to the music of my Figaro. Nothing is played, blown, sung, or whistled but Figaro. No opera is seen as much. It is all a great honor for me." Perhaps that's why he visited the city 5 times, although some were brief. And it was Prague's National Theatre director who then commissioned a second opera, which was Don Giovanni, that was also enthusiastically received. And Lorenzo da Ponte, the librettist, said that Prague audiences had a special love and understanding of the maestro's music. Now in Prague, he often stayed with friends, and during one of his walks with the singer Josefina Duszczak, who was a friend of his, they visited the Strahov Monastery, where Mozart played the famous organ. Now this is a place that is well worth visiting. In 2000, I was part of a choir that went to Prague to sing in their Advent festival, and our hotel was within walking distance of this abbey and monastery. It was founded in 1143 by someone whose name I can't even begin to pronounce, but who was the Bishop of Prague. But it was in 1670 that another abbot, a philosopher and a theologian, had his idea to build a new library. I have to tell you, the ceiling is a wonder to behold. It really is, with frescoes done by 2 Czech artists. And Insider Travel says it is the most beautiful library in the world.
Well, it's interesting because Prague actually survived the Second World War.
It did, because Hitler was enamored with it. He actually said at one point that when he conquered the world, he would like to make Prague his capital. I don't think that the Czechs felt quite the same way, but anyway.
But how amazing to think that history is preserved, and these places where Mozart's premieres happened are all still there.
Well, and I have to tell you, the frescoes, I love this. The frescoes are based on quotes from the Bible that are about acquiring wisdom and using knowledge and education to build upon faith. And on the walls, there are some 250,000 books. But about the room, there are also globes, which was the way the 17th century monks studied the planet. But back to Mozart. He paid his last visit to Prague several months before his death. And on hearing of his death, friends in Prague held a memorial service in the Church of St. Nicholas. About 4,000 people attended, and Josefina would sing, and bells throughout the city were rung. I feel quite privileged because I too have sung in this church. And how they ever got 4,000 people into it, I can't imagine.
Well, it's an amazing too if you think about how Mozart's remains were treated after his death in Vienna. into a pauper's grave. I mean, I think it was probably what they did at the time, but compared to the huge send-off that Beethoven had, for example. But here it is in Prague.
It was in Prague.
In an adopted home, sort of.
I have to tell you, the acoustics in this church are astounding. They made even my voice sound good.
Barb, I'm sure all our listeners agree that your voice sounds good. There's no worry about that.
But the main organ, which Mozart played, has over 4,000 pipes up to 6 meters in length. And another place not to be missed in Prague is the St. Charles Bridge. It crosses over I think it's called the Vltava River, and is the second oldest bridge. And its construction began in 1357, and it's decorated with 30 statues in the Baroque style. However, I have to say, it's not the originals on the bridge anymore, but replicas, because the originals are in the National Museum.
Right. Well, it remains an amazing cultural center as well, too.
Absolutely.
Did you hear much, or did you do much apart from what you were participating in?
Well, I have to tell you, there was a wonderful thing in the thing we were participating in, because when we picked the music that we were going to sing, we picked Canadian carols because we thought that might be something that Czech people wouldn't know. But when we were looking for music, we found this piece called Sleep, My Dear Son, and it said a Czech carol. And what we didn't know was that it's kind of their version of Silent Night. And we sang in 4 different places, and one of them was outdoors in their Advent festival with this big Christmas tree. And when we started to sing this song, the whole audience sang it with us. It was magical.
Oh, breathtaking.
Yes, it was breathtaking. Yeah. It's an incredible city, and if you ever have a chance to go, it is just so worth the visit.
Okay, well, now you mentioned in this The Marriage of Figaro, which is a setting of the second of the 3 Barber of Seville plays by Beaumarchais. And I have a feeling that we're going to be exploring that topic in a few minutes too. But as a way of introducing that topic and going to yet a new place, I wanted to bring you back to Canada just for a second for a little trip to a park bench in Joliet, if I could.
Wonderful.
So here we are in Quebec. If you can picture a friendly but passionate discussion. I was really charmed to live with a French family in Joliet, Quebec, when I competed in the Glory of Mozart International Piano Competition in 1991. My hosts spoke very little English, exceptionally charming, wonderful people, who were even complimentary of my French, which I thought was quite funny. But they had no trouble, expressing themselves in their colorful, passionate way, and it didn't matter how much they disagreed about anything. They would always exude this loving twinkle. And I remember once asking them about their thoughts about the challenges facing French and English speaking Canadians. And as you know, with anything you talked about with them, each of them leapt into different overlapping opinions, and off they went to the races. But they agreed on one thing. They said, "Well, you are here, we are here. What's the problem?" So I absolutely love that, and I just had to capture some of that spirit in a piano prelude. So here is a park bench in Joliet from my Preludes to Canada.
So, Brian, I'm just curious, do you happen to know if Joliet was named after the explorers, Marquette and Joliet?
Geez, I don't know that, Barb. It could well be. I do know that it's this very beautiful, tiny place, quite close to Montreal, 40 or 50 minutes from Montreal, and it's very natural. And it, of course, is the home of the Lanaudière Music Festival, one of Canada's great classical music festivals, which typically welcomes 50,000 people to its outdoor amphitheater, nestled in the woods. Every year, it's really a breathtaking place. It's fantastic.
So as they listen to your piece, they can imagine themselves at the
Exactly.
festival.
Yeah, they'll probably go tell those people to shut up on the park bench. But now that's really fun musical chatter for sure. And I think that our next composer that you want to talk about was an absolute master of musical chatter.
Oh, absolutely.
So where are we going now?
Well, this is the man who famously said, if you give me a laundry list, I can set it to music. Giacomo Rossini wrote The Barber of Seville, and of course, like all operas, love and deception play the prominent role. With Figaro, the barber is the puppet master, and right about now, I'd settle for any barber, even if he was in Seville. So he must help Count Almaviva outwit Dr. Bartolo to secure the lovely Rosina for the Count, and out of the clutches of her lecherous guardian, just like all the typical operas.
Right.
But I love the subtitle. I didn't know it had a subtitle.
What's the subtitle?
The Useless Precaution. I had no idea. Anyway, Giacomo Rossini wrote 39 operas, all before the age of 37. Then, except for a few works, he effectively retired so he could spend his time in his real passions, cooking and eating.
Well, apparently Rossini was a well-traveled composer, but also an extremely well-fed composer.
He was. He once said, eating, loving, singing, and digesting are the 4 acts of the comic opera known as life, and they pass like bubbles in a bottle of champagne. I find it interesting that eating should come before loving, but anyway. We know about his eating habits, but it turns out that second place with him also got quite a workout. His first wife was the glamorous opera singer, Isabella Colbrand, but his second was Olympe Pellicier, I believe that's how you say her name. She was a courtesan whose lovers include Honoré de Balzac. But they were bound by a common passion. As she once wrote, "We are unwell. It is from eating too much. The maestro and I love to eat, and we acquit ourselves of this duty religiously." She also said, "I am neither proud nor gracious. I am a fat woman who is occupied from morning to evening with digesting." I feel a bit like that in this quarantine, I have to tell you. At any rate, Rossini, like Handel, was a fast writer, and he composed The Barber of Seville in 3 weeks. The first performance, however, was not well received, and so Rossini stayed home for the next one. Different audience, different reaction. This group was enchanted, and when the opera was finished, the fans gathered outside Rossini's home and cheered. Because of his frequent use of crescendo, the sobriquet Signor Crescendo was given him. But in the Grove's Dictionary of Music, it says, "The crescendo degenerated into a mere mannerism with Rossini, in whose works it is used with wearisome iteration."
Well, it's amazing to think that the work of Rossini is coming right alongside the work of Beethoven, the mature works of Beethoven, and it's such a completely different world.
Absolutely. He also said one time how wonderful opera would be if there were no singers.
Well, I think he also said, after a particularly florid rendition of the opera's big aria, Una voce poco fa, Rossini's reported to have asked the soprano, "Very nice, my dear. And who wrote the piece that you've just performed?"
Well, he was quite the character. He said he apparently cried only 3 times in his life. When he heard Paganini play, when he whistled his first opera, And when during a boat ride he lost a turkey stuffed with truffles overboard. But I have to say, I have been to Seville, and it is a beautiful city. It is famous worldwide for its culture and its artistic heritage. It was the birthplace of flamenco, but this I found fascinating. It's supposedly the burial place of Christopher Columbus. Two places claim to be the resting place for this explorer, Seville and Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Originally, he was buried in another Spanish city, but his son Diego had his remains exhumed and sent to a monastery in Seville. There they stayed until 1542, when they were packed up and sent to Santo Domingo to be placed in their new cathedral. But when France took over the island, the explorers' remains were sent to Cuba. But when Cuba declared their independence, they were sent back and placed in an ornate tomb in Seville's cathedral.
Good Lord, the consummate traveler.
I was going to say that Columbus got around. So when reconstruction work took place in the Dominican church, a box of bones marked the illustrious and excellent Don Colon, Admiral of the Sea, were found. But Columbus's son Diego was also given this title. However, the Dominican built a large tomb for the bones called the Columbus Lighthouse. Don't ask me why they gave it that name, but anyway. But in 2006, DNA testing on the Seville fragments confirmed they belonged to Columbus. Scientists had extracted DNA from bones known to belong to Columbus's brother, and there was apparently an absolute familial matchup. So the Dominican politely declined any comment and said they're a very religious people and they didn't want to exhume the bones that they had in their lighthouse to find out who they belonged to.
Oh my goodness. Well, we've traveled quite some way from Seville in this amazing conversation. Can you bring us back to Seville? You say you've been there.
I have.
And how did you enjoy the cultural life there, or the history, or what?
I loved it. You know, Madrid is like any sort of major city in the world. Barcelona, of course, is beautiful with the things that were designed by Gaudi, which are rather gaudy, I might say.
Right,
But
right.
anyway, but Seville has this feeling of antiquity about it, and of course it has a river that flows through it. And I mean, the cathedral, I went to an organ concert in the cathedral, which blew me away because they have two huge pipe organs, and the one organist can't see the other, so they had to put like kind of mirrors up so that they could at least communicate. Yeah, right. Quite wonderful, and lots of great restaurants, and of course tapas. I mean, it's just a marvelous place to walk around.
Right, and apparently you can get a whale of a haircut there too. Well, now we're going back to Canada, and you mentioned a river that goes through Seville, and I wanted to talk about a Canadian river now. This is the mighty Red River. The Red River begins at the southern border of Canada between Minnesota and North Dakota, and it flows north up through Manitoba, including flowing through Winnipeg, and it empties finally into Lake Winnipeg. It's like the stem of the maple leaf that extends straight up into the very center of our country.
Wow.
It's quite a wonderful metaphor. The Manitoba portion of the Red River is designated as a Canadian Heritage River due to its cultural and historic value. And as it flows through the rich agricultural districts all around there, the Red is known for its volatility from, complete drought to overwhelming flood. We hear about it in the news all the time.
Yeah, there's been a couple like in the last few years, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
It's a restless giant, this thing. So while depicting the sort of gentle but relentless momentum of this mighty river, this piece called Red River Dreams offers a loving prayer, like the release of a holy energy. So many, as with every river, it holds centuries of sunny and dark secrets beneath its gentle waves. So
Wonderful.
I wanted to share this with everybody. Here is Red River Dreams from My Preludes to Canada. that was Red River Dreams from my Preludes to Canada. Now, a really special treat, Barb. We have a guest performer today.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, but before we get to that, where are we going next?
Well, we are going to stay in Czechoslovakia, and we are going to listen to some music by a composer. I found differing pronunciations of his name. I always referred to him as Smetana, but when I talked to a friend who's Czech, they said Smetana.
Well, and I know people who say Smetana.
So I think it's a bit like the Hallelujah chorus. You can stand or you can sit. He once wrote, "With God's grace and help, I would like to be a Mozart in composition and a Liszt in technique." But he's interesting because he was a very nationalistic composer.
Well, we're talking a little later as well, too, from the Rossini, which was early 1800s. Now we're in 1870s or so?
Yes.
Right, okay.
But like Mozart, he was a child prodigy. He performed in a string quartet at the age of 5.
Wow.
He gave a solo performance at 6, and he wrote his first compositions at 8. And he came from the country to attend school in Prague. His father was working class, and he was bullied relentlessly at school, ridiculed for his poor grasp of the Czech language because most of the people in the countryside spoke German. And he apparently was lacking, so his classmates said, in city manners. So not surprisingly, he dropped out of school. And he didn't learn Czech until he was 40 years old. But he did more for the popularization of the Czech language and folk music than any of those who tormented him. He became a national hero. In the early 1870s, he went completely deaf. Did you know that?
Yeah, I did know that. It's just absolutely tragic. It's around the composition of the piece that we're going to be sharing.
That's right. Yet he managed to compose his challenging second string quartet, which one musicologist has said was an autobiographical account of the final decade of his life. Wow. And he died in an insane asylum the year after it was written. But the Moldau is one of 6 movements of his work called Ma Vlast, which means my homeland. And the Moldau depicts the river, which has its beginnings as 2 small springs in the Bohemian woods. And they join up, and they become the river flowing through the countryside until it arrives in Prague. Each stage of the journey is depicted with a musical motif and paints a musical picture of the scenery. The 2 separate streams, they're represented by the flute and the clarinet, and they play these rippling notes, which eventually are taken over by the lower strings, and the strings have now become a stream. And when we hear the river, the melody has moved into the violins. And as the river flows, it moves past hunters, and Smetana describes this as the merry sounds of the hunt and the notes of the hunter's horn. And the hunt, of course, is heard in the brass section, while the strings continue to mimic the fast-flowing river. And then in the 3rd segment, the river evokes a fairy tale. It is night, and Smetana says, wood and water nymphs revel in its sparkling waters. And here he makes use of flutes, muted strings, and a harp. And I mentioned the harp because I know what we are going to hear. And I have to tell you, this, for me, was one of the most spellbinding things I have ever been fortunate enough to hear at Westben. I have heard many, but this stands out as something that just took me to another place altogether.
Yeah, and this was something, when I first heard her recording of this, I've had the exact same reaction, and it was that I began to figure out how I could hire her to perform at Westben. So we're really thrilled to include this wonderful recording of the Moldau by Quebec harpist Valerie Milot. And she's not only a wonderful harpist, I should say, but she's also the arranger of what you're about to hear. And I had a question for you, Barb. You know this recording, and we're going to enjoy it in a few seconds, but do you miss all those beautiful orchestral instruments?
I didn't in hers at all. I mean, it's another approach to it, but when I closed my eyes at that performance, I felt like I was on the river. I could see the river. I mean, it was just, It was spellbinding, and as I say, it took me back to Prague. It evoked so many memories, and I just was blown away by her technique. She made it seem so effortless, and when I did open my eyes and watch her fingers, I thought, oh my goodness, how do you do that?
Yeah, true. So can we listen to it now?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is the Moldau by Bedřich Smetana, performed here by Quebec harpist Valerie Milot, and hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. That was Valerie Milo with The Moldau by Smetana. Well, as always, it's been a wonderful trip with you, Barb.
Well, I don't think the trip should end. So here are some suggestions. In your home, put on a Viennese waltz. Have a waltz around your kitchen, or pretend...
Well, you can even do that in a long dress and tails.
You can, or pretend that you're sitting out on an outdoor cafe having what they call coffee, which I call fuel. Or you could take a trip to Scotland and listen to Mendelssohn's Fingal's Cave, which I adore. Or my personal favorite, I know, Brian, you know this, that a year and a half ago when I turned 70, 7 friends and I rented a villa outside of Florence and went there for my birthday. And it was...
And the country's never been the same.
It was the trip of a lifetime. The interesting thing was that 3 of them didn't know the other people, and yet we all got along. And so my favorite thing to do would be have a glass of Santa Margherita Prosecco, a bit of chocolate or a bit of cheese, and listen to Bach's Italian Concerto.
Oh, that sounds just heavenly. I might do that right after we hang up, Barb.
I might too.
Well, thanks again for joining us. And just a reminder to everybody that we love to hear from our listeners. Please drop us a line at westben@westben.ca. Westben@westben.ca. And tune into our mailbag podcasts, because we love to share your notes on the air and fumble through some of your questions. We always have a good time doing that. So send in any thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today, especially to you, Barb. This is Music for a While. I'm Brian Finley. See you next time. Happy trails.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Westben's podcast Music for a While. To Barb and Brian, thank you for that adventure and for sharing all of those wonderful stories about how music connects to such a broad range of places. Last but certainly not least, thank you again to both of our sponsors of this episode, Finley & Associates and Cameco. The support of all of our sponsors allows Westben to continue to innovate and create new ways to connect through music. So thank you. A simple way for listeners to support this podcast is to share it with friends, family, neighbors, and any other music lovers in your life. Subscribing to our YouTube channel is another way, or to the podcast itself on iTunes. Subscribing helps the mystical algorithm of the internet know to share this podcast with new viewers. We would love to continue growing our Westben community, so that would mean a great deal. There is so much more to see at Westben online right now, from Westben Kids, musical moments, to digital concerts at the barn, to much, much more. Please visit www.westben.ca to enjoy all of the creative ways we continue to experience music at Westben. I am Samantha Clark, the producer of this podcast, and I hope you are remaining healthy and hopeful. I am very appreciative if you've made it this far. Thank you again for listening.